talking about Cuban influences, I sort of felt there were some echoes, reminiscences of somewhat Cuban themes and even literary themes. And I'm not just restricting them to Cuba, but to Latin American literature, especially the Latin American literature that happened during the so-called boom.
Neo-Barroco?
Well, Garcia Marquez,
Jorge
Luis Borges, the so-called boom of Latin American literature. Interestingly enough, it's not a boom there, it's a boom here. So it's the Western world sort
perceiving
of like
something
something differently. I'm bringing that and translating all this work, Alejo Carpentier, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is Colombian, but spent most of his life in Cuba, like Ernest Hemingway, and did most of
Mexico,
his writing
Cuba,
there.
Europe.
Exactly, and was a very good friend of Castro until he said that he wasn't agreeing with him anymore, and he was, expelled from Cuba. So that's basically the story. But I did feel that in your narrative there is this tone of magic realism at times, and it's a very beautiful, lyrical language that you develop in your narrative that is very enticing and very seductive. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Are there any particular references? Is this something that is coming due to your Cubanism as well?
Yeah.
Or is something that is more elaborate in the sense that it's the byproduct of your own intellectual search?
Right. Well, I've read I've read not everything they've written, but I've read all the writers you mentioned. As part of my own, I'm an autodidact. I started college and it wasn't for me, but that didn't stop me from educating myself. And as a writer, you have to read. And I think that having grown up, I was close to my grandparents, neither of whom were born in the mainland U.S. They were both born in the Caribbean. So I think from an early age, I had a direct connection to the Latin American as opposed to just Latino sensibility, and they weren't extremely educated people. They were literate. My grandparents, they both read and wrote, but they didn't knock back Dostoevsky novels or anything like that. But I think that had a big influence on how I perceived the world as someone descended of them. Or ascended of them, however that works. So I think the answer to your question is two-part. I think a lot of what I read that I really enjoy, that inspires me, perhaps I somehow reinterpret that style and sensibility in my own writing. Because I really don't think about it a lot. Like a lot of writers, I go into a trance, and there's several layers of editing
of course.
Cutting and elaborating and. But I do like stream of consciousness. I love, in writing, I love the employment of flashback. I love characters looking back. And in Contraband, it's really important because
it is.
He's gotten to a very bleak point in his life. And the only happiness he can remember is in the past. So what I was able to do with him flashing back and telling all of these elaborate stories, even though it comes across as circular, it winds up coming back to where it starts and helping the plot to advance with the reader having more information about his life without making the exposition dull. Because exposition can be very dull. So some of those dreamlike sequences where he's talking about his childhood and
which happen to be very cinematographic.
The grandeur of the cities and lovers in the park. Like what happened to all that?
And the decadence, then
the decadence, the art, the architecture. What happened to all of that? Why are we living in such a bleak world suddenly? How did it change so quickly? And I think that his paranoid aspects come from my grandmother. I don't know if this exists in your family as much. My grandmother was very paranoid. And as kids, we we found it somewhat humorous because she was a really quirky woman anyway.
You're talking about the Cuban one.
My Cuban grandmother.
You know, it's interesting that you're touching on the paranoia, because I think that Cubans in general have been induced to paranoia, and I think that a lot of this has to do with the fact that Cuba never had a history of democracy, so it's always been a history of coup d'etat,
dictatorships,
somebody that always comes
imperialism,
and kills whoever was there before. Very Macbeth.
That's crazy.
I mean, Cuba is very Macbeth, and it's interesting that you're touching on that, because I do believe that yes, there is such a thing as a social paranoia, especially in that context, which, by the way, is very latent in your novel.
Yeah, no, that was very intentional.
Definitely,
it was very intentional.
And I think it's one of the hooks that it has, but also one of the underlying techniques that propel the action, is moving the action forward. That sense of paranoia, that being observed or heard, or not being able to trust because you don't know who can tell on you. And you know, I felt very touched by that, especially coming from, you know, the context I'm coming from. Say
an extremely Cuban context.
You know, I mean, I am definitely a product of that system. I grew up there. I had access to a fantastic education because of my father's position, you know, in the government, and also because of my talent, and because of the fact that then, you know, you learned that at an early age that you couldn't really be trusting of anybody. So going back to that sense of paranoia that is almost as enticing as castrating in your novel, is one of those feelings that I had when I was reading Contraband. You know, it came to my mind, well, I need to ask Charlie, where is this really coming from? Is this something that, did you grow up with this around, and now you're telling me, well, definitely.
From Grandma, it comes from Grandma, and she would always say, I mean, Grandma came in the late 40s to New York from Havana, and never went back. Interestingly, she lived, like I said, on the West Coast for a while when her brother came over, and then wound up in Miami with my aunt, and she died in 2005. But as kids, you know, she was always being followed. She didn't trust white Americans, no matter who they were, no matter how long she knew them for. You know, she was always watching out for something. And as kids, we just thought it was part of her just getting old and maybe losing touch with something, you know. And I think that when I went on my own and delved into Cuban history in books written about the revolution and just Cuban history from the colonial era to the 1990s, or about that, whatever I was able to find, I would devour, because it was my own way of learning about a place that, interestingly, I've never stepped foot in, but has helped to shape my consciousness through my family consciousness. My family consciousness is extremely Cuban, because my Cuban grandmother was the closest grandparent. She was the grandparent I was closest to.
So she definitely...
So even though my other grandparents were Puerto Rican, I mean, she had the biggest
influence,
impact on me. And then, you know, years later, it was like trying to find, again, Contraband, Cuban literature, and just the title, I think, just jives so much with what I wanted to write. It came to me later. It was called something different, which I'm not going to tell you. But then later on, I realized that Contraband as a metaphor became so many things in the book. It was like the secrets that he's harboring. When he gets he gets sold as a slave, and there's a scene where when he meets his traveling partner, they get put into this container at the bottom of a ship. His government secrets, his sexuality. When he finally gets to that, he's having issues. There was a time in his life when he was able to kind of be who he wanted to be, and he gets to the nation gets to a point in its history where it's not so safe and not so okay to do all the things you want to do. So just a lot. There's a lot of concealment. There's